The morning mist clung to the coral reefs surrounding Okinawa. Like a shroud of foreboding on April 1, 1945, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood aboard the USS Indianapolis, watching through his binoculars as the largest Pacific amphibious assault force in history approached the Japanese island. What should have been met with thunderous enemy fire was instead greeted by an eerie silence that made seasoned Marines shift uncomfortably in their landing craft. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding the newly formed 10th Army, had expected fierce resistance on the beaches. His forces comprised the 24th Army Corps and the 3rd Amphibious Corps, totaling over 180,000 troops. The plan, codenamed Operation Iceberg, called for a swift capture of the island that would serve as the final stepping stone to Japan's home islands. Intelligence estimates suggested the operation would last no more than 3 weeks, as the first wave of Marines from the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions stormed ashore. At Hagushi Beach, they found abandoned enemy positions and scattered equipment. The anticipated bloodbath had not materialized. Major General Roy Geiger, commanding the 3rd Amphibious Corps, radioed his observations to Buckner. Minimal resistance encountered, advancing inland per schedule, but Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, the Japanese commander defending Okinawa, had no intention of wasting his 32nd Army in futile beach defenses. From his command post deep within Shuri Castle, he watched American forces pour ashore through his field glasses, a slight smile playing across his weathered face. His chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, stood beside him, equally confident in their defensive strategy. "Let them come," Ushijima murmured to Cho. "They walk into the mouth of the dragon willingly." The Japanese had spent months transforming Okinawa's southern region into an impregnable fortress, using the island's natural cave systems and limestone ridges. They had constructed a defense in depth that would channel American forces into carefully prepared killing zones. The plan was simple yet devastating. Allow the Americans to establish themselves on the island, then bleed them white in a war of attrition that would make any invasion of Japan itself seem impossibly costly. By nightfall on Love Day, as the Americans had designated the first day of the assault, over 60,000 troops were ashore. The rapid advance continued for several days, with American forces capturing both Kadena and Yontan airfields with surprising ease. Buckner began to wonder if Japanese resistance had finally crumbled under the weight of America's island-hopping campaign. The illusion shattered on April 4th when the 7th Infantry Division, advancing south toward Shuri, encountered the outer defenses of the Kakazu Ridge. What followed was a baptism of fire that would define the next 82 days of hell. Machine gun nests emerged from seemingly solid rock, mortar rounds fell with surgical precision, and Japanese defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they would never see home again. The easy advance was over. The real battle of Okinawa was about to begin. As referenced in historian Roy Appelman's comprehensive work Okinawa, The Last Battle, the initial lack of resistance was a calculated deception that would ultimately cost American forces dearly in the weeks to come. The morning sun of April 9th, 1945, cast long shadows across the blood-soaked coral ridges as Colonel Edwin May's 105th Infantry Regiment prepared for another assault on Kakazu Ridge. For 5 days, his men had thrown themselves against the Japanese positions, only to be repulsed with devastating casualties. The ridge had become a symbol of Japanese resistance and American determination. Private First Class Charles Moynihan crouched in a shell crater, his rifle clutched tightly as mortar rounds exploded around him. The 19-year-old from Ohio had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, dreaming of quick victory and hometown parades. Now, surrounded by the screams of wounded comrades and the acrid smell of cordite, those dreams seemed like memories from another lifetime. "Move out," shouted Lieutenant Robert Nishimura, a Japanese-American officer whose family had been interned in California while he fought for his country. The irony was not lost on him as he led his predominantly white platoon against positions defended by men who shared his ancestry. War had a way of making such distinctions both meaningless and painfully relevant. The assault began with a thunderous artillery barrage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the island. 155mm howitzers, naval, guns from offshore battleships, and dive bombers from the captured airfields pounded the ridge for 30 minutes. When the barrage lifted, infantrymen emerged from their positions like ants from a disturbed hill, rushing forward with bayonets fixed. Japanese defenders, led by Colonel Sunio Shimura of the 62nd Division, had survived the bombardment in deep caves and tunnels carved into the limestone bedrock. As American troops approached the ridge's crest, machine gun nests that had seemed destroyed suddenly came alive with deadly fire. The advance stalled within minutes. Captain Joseph McCarthy's company reached within 50 yards of the ridge's peak before encountering a network of interconnected bunkers that seemed to appear from nowhere. His radio man, Corporal James Washington, called desperately for fire support as Japanese knee mortars began dropping rounds with frightening accuracy among the exposed Americans. "We need immediate support on Kakazu," Washington screamed into his radio. "They're cutting us to pieces." Lieutenant General Buckner, monitoring the battle from his command post, felt the first stirrings of doubt about the operation's timeline. Intelligence had grossly underestimated Japanese defensive preparations. Each ridge captured revealed another fortified position behind it, stretching south toward Shuri like a deadly necklace of coral and steel. Meanwhile, offshore, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner watched the casualty reports pile up on his desk. The Navy hospital ships were filling faster than anticipated, and requests for ammunition were exceeding all projections. What was supposed to be a 3-week operation was consuming resources at an alarming rate. In the Japanese command bunker beneath Shuri Castle, General Ushijima reviewed the day's reports with quiet satisfaction. His strategy of trading space for American blood was working exactly as planned. Each yard of ground cost the invaders dozens of casualties, while his own losses remained manageable. His aide, Captain Minoru Yokoi, reported that American morale appeared to be suffering under the constant pressure. "Excellent," Ushijima nodded. "Send orders to all units. Continue the defense in depth. Make them pay for every foot of coral." As darkness fell on April 9th, Kakazu Ridge remained in Japanese hands. American casualties for the day exceeded 800, while Japanese losses numbered fewer than 50. The mathematics of attrition were becoming clear to both sides. For the Americans, victory would require a price in blood that seemed to grow with each passing day. For the Japanese, the question was whether they could maintain their defense long enough to make the cost of invading Japan itself appear prohibitive. The Battle of Okinawa had become exactly what Ushijima had envisioned, a preview of what awaited American forces on the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu. On April 6, 1945, Seaman First Class William Henderson stood at his battle station aboard the destroyer USS Lloyds, scanning the horizon for the telltale silhouettes of approaching aircraft. The 20-year-old gunner's mate from Tennessee had survived the campaigns at Guadalcanal and Light, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to descend from the cloudy skies above Okinawa. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, had been planning this moment for months. From his headquarters in Kyushu, he coordinated the largest kamikaze offensive in history. Operation Kikasui-1 would unleash over 700 aircraft in a coordinated suicide attack against the American fleet supporting the Okinawa invasion. The cherry blossoms, for which the operation was named, would fall like rain upon the enemy ships. 20-year-old Flight Petty Officer Yukio Seki had volunteered for the Special Attack Corps 3 months earlier, following in the footsteps of the original kamikaze pilots who had first struck at Light Gulf. His Mitsubishi Zero, loaded with a 500-pound bomb, was part of a formation of 40 aircraft approaching the radar picket ships stationed north of Okinawa. "All ships, this is Sky Control," crackled the voice of Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell over the radio net. Large formations of bogies approaching from the north. "All hands to battle stations." The radar operators aboard the USS Eldorado had been tracking the incoming formations for 30 minutes, watching in growing alarm as more and more blips appeared on their screens. This was unlike previous air attacks, which typically involved smaller groups of conventional bombers. The sheer number of aircraft suggested something unprecedented was about to unfold. Captain Frederick Moosbrugger, commanding Destroyer Squadron 61, positioned his ships in a defensive screen round the vulnerable transports and supply vessels near the beachhead. His flagship, USS Kidd, bristled with anti-aircraft weapons as the crew prepared for the onslaught. The veteran destroyer captain had faced kamikaze attacks before, but the approaching formation dwarfed anything he had previously encountered. The first wave struck the radar picket ships at 1400 hours. USS Bush, stationed 30 miles north of the main fleet, found herself surrounded by diving aircraft as Flight Petty Officer Saki's formation selected her as their primary target. Seaman First Class Robert Hansen, manning a 20mm gun mount, fired continuously as Japanese planes dove through the defensive fire with single-minded determinate. "Ian, here comes another one," Hansen shouted to his gun crew as a Zero, trailing smoke from multiple hits, continued its deadly dive toward the ship's bridge. The aircraft struck amidships with a tremendous explosion that lifted the destroyer's bow clear of the water. Within minutes, Bush was listing heavily to port, her back broken by the kamikaze's bomb nearby. USS Colquhoun attempted to assist the stricken destroyer, but was herself targeted by 3 more kamikazes. Despite desperate maneuvering and intense anti-aircraft fire, 2 of the suicide planes found their mark. The destroyer's magazine detonated in a pillar of flame visible from 20 miles away, taking most of her crew with her. Admiral Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, watched in horror from his flagship as the casualty reports flooded in. In 6 hours of sustained kamikaze attacks, the Japanese had sunk or damaged over 30 American vessels. The hospital ship USS Comfort, clearly marked with red crosses and operating under the protection of international law, was deliberately targeted and severely damaged, killing medical personnel treating wounded soldiers. As night fell on April 6th, the full scope of the disaster became apparent. Operation Kikasui-1 had achieved its primary objective of demonstrating Japanese willingness to sacrifice everything in defense of their homeland. While the Americans had shot down over 300 attacking aircraft, the psychological impact of the coordinated suicide attacks reverberated throughout the fleet. Aboard the command ship USS Eldorado, Admiral Nimitz reviewed the casualty figures with growing concern. The kamikaze attacks had killed over 700 American sailors and wounded thousands more. If this level of fanatical resistance was being encountered at Okinawa, what would await American forces when they attempted to invade Japan itself? The question haunted him as reports of additional kamikaze formations continued to arrive throughout the night. May 1st, 1945, dawned gray and rainy across the central highlands of Okinawa, where the ancient fortress of Shuri Castle dominated the landscape like a medieval keep. Brigadier General Claudius Easley's 96th Infantry Division had been battering against the outer defenses of the Shuri line for 3 weeks, gaining ground measured in yards rather than miles. Each concrete bunker and limestone cave represented hours of brutal combat and dozens of American casualties. Staff Sergeant Mitchell Red Cloud, a Winnebago Indian from Wisconsin, led his squad through the maze of destroyed buildings that had once been the village of Takeshi. The 25-year-old veteran had earned 2 Purple Hearts in the campaign, but continued to refuse evacuation despite his wounds. His men trusted him implicitly, knowing that his tactical instincts had kept them alive through weeks of hell. "Keep your heads down," Red Cloud whispered to his squad as they approached a seemingly empty concrete structure. "Charlie's in there somewhere." The Japanese defenders, under the command of Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, had transformed every building, every cave, and every ridge into a fortress. Yahara, considered one of Japan's most brilliant defensive strategists, had designed the Shuri line to channel American attacks into predetermined killing zones, where interlocking fields of fire would maximize casualties. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, a mortar operator with the 1st Marine Division, crouched behind the ruins of a stone wall, preparing to fire on a machine gun nest that had been tormenting his company for 2 days. The young Marine from Alabama had kept a detailed diary throughout the campaign, documenting the descent into a kind of warfare that seemed to strip away humanity itself. "The stench is unbearable," Sledge wrote during a brief lull in the fighting. "Bodies lie everywhere, bloated and crawling with maggots. We've become like animals, concerned only with survival and killing." The assault on the Shuri line had bogged down into a nightmarish battle of attrition reminiscent of the Western Front in World War I. Flamethrower teams advanced under covering fire to incinerate Japanese positions, only to discover that the defenders had simply retreated deeper into their cave systems. Artillery barrages that should have obliterated defensive positions merely drove the enemy underground, where they waited to emerge and fight again. Captain John Thorson's Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 184th Infantry had been reduced to 37 men from its original strength of 190. The Minnesota National Guard unit had been fighting continuously for 18 days, advancing less than 800 yards in that time. Thorson, a former high school principal, found himself making life and death decisions that no civilian training had prepared him for. In the Japanese command bunker beneath Shuri Castle, General Ushijima received reports from his subordinate commanders with mixed emotions. The defense was succeeding beyond his most optimistic projections, but ammunition and supplies were running critically low. More importantly, the constant American artillery bombardment was taking a psychological toll on his troops that concerned him deeply. "Sir," reported Major Kaji Hinode, his intelligence officer, "American casualties for the month of April exceeded 28,000. Our own losses number approximately 8,000. Ushijima nodded grimly. The mathematics were favorable, but he understood that America's industrial capacity could replace its losses while Japan could not. Time was running against them, despite their tactical successes, as detailed in Ernie Pyle's final dispatch before his death on Ishima. The Battle of Okinawa had become a grinding war of attrition that was consuming both armies at an alarming rate. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Randall, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 105th Infantry, studied his maps in a captured Japanese bunker that served as his command post. His unit had been assigned to capture Hill 178, a seemingly minor objective that had cost his battalion over 100 casualties. In 5 days of fighting, the hill's caves and tunnels seemed to extend infinitely into the coral bedrock, requiring individual clearing by flamethrower teams and demolition charges. The weather had turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire that made movement difficult, and evacuation of wounded nearly impossible. Corpsmen carrying stretchers often came under sniper fire, and the Japanese had shown no hesitation in targeting medical personnel, despite the protections of the Geneva Convention. As May 1st drew to a close, the Shuri line remained intact despite weeks of American assault. The ancient castle still flew the rising sun flag, visible to American troops throughout the southern end of the island. It had become a symbol of Japanese resistance and American frustration, a constant reminder that victory would require a price in blood that was beginning to trouble even the most hardened commanders. The morning of May 21st, 1945, brought a hellish rain that turned the approaches to Shuri Castle into rivers of blood and mud. Technical Sergeant Beaufort Anderson, a demolitions expert with the 1st Battalion, 181st Infantry, worked methodically to place shaped charges against a Japanese bunker that had held up his company's advance. For 3 days, the 26-year-old combat engineer from Minnesota had survived Guadalcanal and New Guinea, but Okinawa was proving to be deadlier than anything he had previously experienced. The Japanese position, carved deep into the limestone bedrock, appeared impervious to conventional assault. Captain Tatsumi Hibata and his company of the 24th Division had constructed overlapping fields of fire that made approach nearly suicidal. Every yard of ground cost American attackers multiple casualties. While the defenders remained relatively protected in their cave system, Colonel Hamilton White, commanding the 181st Infantry Regiment, had watched his unit's strength dwindle from 3,000 men to fewer than 800 effective combatants. The regiment, originally composed of Massachusetts National Guard troops, had been fighting continuously for 7 weeks. Many of his soldiers showed signs of what military psychiatrists were beginning to call combat fatigue, though the men simply called it being rock-happy. "We can't sustain these losses much longer," White confided to his executive officer, Major Robert Pierce. "At this rate, we'll be combat ineffective within 2 weeks." The statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. American casualties on Okinawa had exceeded 60,000 by mid-May, with no end to the fighting in sight. Hospital ships shuttled back and forth to Guam and the Philippines, loaded with wounded soldiers and Marines who had been chewed up in the coral ridges of southern Okinawa. First Lieutenant Harvey Fisher, a company commander with the 7th Marines, had seen his unit reduced to 43 men from an original strength of 240. The young officer from Oregon found himself commanding what amounted to a reinforced platoon, while carrying the responsibilities of a full company. His men, many of them teenagers, had aged years in the weeks since the landing. "Sir," reported Corporal James Murphy, Fisher's radio man, "Colonel says we're getting replacements tomorrow. 50 new men." Fisher nodded warily, knowing that most of the replacements would be casualties within their first week of combat. The Japanese had perfected the art of defensive warfare to a degree that maximized American losses, while preserving their own strength. It was becoming clear that capturing Okinawa might cost more American lives than any previous Pacific campaign. In his command bunker, General Ushijima received increasingly desperate reports from his subordinate commanders. American artillery, coordinated with close air support, was systematically destroying his defensive positions. More critically, his ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted, and there was no prospect of resupply from the Japanese homeland. "We have inflicted tremendous casualties on the enemy," Colonel Yahara reported during the daily staff meeting, "but we cannot hold our current positions indefinitely." Ushijima understood the implications. His 32nd Army had fought magnificently, but the mathematics of attrition were finally turning against them. American industrial capacity could replace losses in men and material, while Japan's resources were stretched beyond the breaking point. The decision to withdraw from the Shuri Line was perhaps the most difficult of Ushijima's military career. The ancient castle had become a symbol of Japanese resistance, visible to both sides throughout the southern battlefield. Abandoning it would represent a significant psychological victory for the Americans, but continuing to defend it would result in the complete destruction of his remaining forces. On the night of May 22nd, Japanese forces began their withdrawal from the Shuri Line under cover of darkness and torrential rain. The movement was conducted with typical Japanese discipline and attention to detail, leaving behind only rearguard units to delay American pursuit. By dawn, most of the 32nd Army had successfully moved to prepared positions on the Kian Peninsula at the southern tip of the island. American patrols entering the ruins of Shuri Castle on May 29th found only empty bunkers and abandoned equipment. The Japanese had escaped to fight again, extending the campaign for at least another month. For the exhausted American troops, the capture of Shuri was both a victory and a harbinger of more casualties to come. The Battle of Okinawa was entering its final phase, but the bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. June 1st, 1945, found the remnants of the Japanese 32nd Army making their final stand. On the windswept cliffs of the Kian Peninsula, General Ushijima had withdrawn his surviving forces to a series of prepared positions, overlooking the southern beaches of Okinawa, where limestone caves and coral ridges provided natural fortifications that would exact a final, terrible price from the pursuing Americans. Corporal Sterling Mace, a machine gunner with the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, scrambled up the rocky slopes of Hill 89 with his weapon team, seeking positions from which to support the morning's assault. The 20-year-old Marine from New York had been fighting on Okinawa for 2 months, watching his unit's strength steadily erode under the constant pressure of Japanese resistance. "Set up here," Mace directed his assistant gunner, Private First Class Bill Lydon, as they reached a small depression that offered both cover and fields of fire. "Watch for movement in those caves." The Japanese positions were commanded by Colonel Hitoshi Kanayama, whose 89th Infantry Regiment had been reduced to fewer than 400 men. Kaneyama, a veteran of the China campaigns, understood that this would be his final battle. His orders from General Ushijima were simple: sell their lives as dearly as possible and inflict maximum casualties on the American forces. Major General Pedro del Valle, commanding the 1st Marine Division, studied the terrain through binoculars from his forward command post. The Kiin Peninsula presented a defender's paradise, with interlocking cave systems that allowed Japanese forces to appear and disappear like ghosts. Every advance would require methodical clearing of individual positions, a process that consumed both time and lives at an alarming rate. It's going to be another meat grinder, Del Valle confided to his operations officer, Colonel Merwin Silverthorne. These positions are even stronger than what we faced at Shuri. The final phase of the Okinawa campaign had indeed become a systematic reduction of Japanese cave complexes, each defended by soldiers who expected to die in place. Flamethrower teams, supported by demolition charges and direct fire from tanks, advanced methodically across the peninsula. The work was dangerous and exhausting, requiring individual courage and small unit coordination at the highest level. Sergeant Major John Bassalone, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Guadalcanal, would have recognized the type of fighting that consumed American forces on the Kiin Peninsula. Every position required direct assault, often at point-blank range, with success measured by individual acts of heroism rather than tactical brilliance. Private First Class Franklin Sigler, a flamethrower operator with the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, approached a cave opening that showed signs of recent occupation. The 19-year-old from Pennsylvania carried 60 pounds of jellied gasoline on his back, making him both an effective weapon against Japanese positions and a priority target for enemy marksmen. "Cover me," Sigler called to his protective team as he prepared to clear the cave. The flamethrower's burst illuminated the limestone interior with hellish orange light, revealing the silhouettes of Japanese soldiers who had chosen death over surrender. General Simon Buckner, commanding the 10th Army, established his forward headquarters less than 2 miles from the front lines to maintain personal control over the final phase of the campaign. The decision would prove fatal when Japanese artillery, firing from carefully concealed positions, bracketed the American command post with deadly accuracy. On June 18, 1945, General Buckner was killed by coral fragments thrown up by an enemy shell explosion. He became the highest-ranking American officer killed in the Pacific War, a victim of his own determination to lead from the front. Command of the 10th Army passed to Major General Roy Geiger, making him the 1st Marine officer to command a field army in combat. In the Japanese command bunker, General Ushijima prepared for his own death with traditional Japanese ceremony. His forces had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 effective combatants, and ammunition supplies were completely exhausted. The time had come for the final act of the Okinawa tragedy. "We have fought well," Ushijima told his staff during their final meeting. "Our sacrifice will demonstrate to the Americans the cost of invading our homeland." On June 21st, as American forces closed in on the final Japanese positions, General Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Cho, committed ritual suicide rather than face capture. Their deaths marked the effective end of organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa, though isolated groups would continue fighting for several more days. The mathematics of the Okinawa campaign were sobering for American planners, considering the invasion of Japan. In 82 days of fighting, American forces had suffered over 82,000 casualties, including 12,000 killed in action. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000, while civilian casualties reached tragic proportions that would haunt both sides for generations. The morning of June 22, 1945, brought an unnatural silence to the coral ridges of southern Okinawa. As the guns finally fell quiet after 82 days of continuous combat, Major General Roy Geiger, now commanding the 10th Army following General Buckner's death, stood among the limestone caves where the last Japanese resistance had been eliminated. Contemplating the terrible cost of victory, the final casualty reports painted a picture that would fundamentally alter American strategy. For the remainder of the Pacific War, 12,393 Americans had died capturing Okinawa, while another 36,000 had been wounded. The figures represented the highest casualty rate of any Pacific campaign, exceeding even the bloodiest battles in Europe. Colonel James McCormick, a staff officer with the Joint Chiefs of Staff who had flown to Okinawa to assess the campaign, walked through the devastated landscape with growing alarm. If a single Japanese island, defended by fewer than 120,000 troops, could inflict such casualties on attacking forces, what would be the cost of invading Japan's home islands, where millions of soldiers and civilians waited? In prepared positions, Secretary of War Henry Stimson had requested detailed assessments of Japanese fighting capacity. Based on the Okinawa experience, the reports reaching Washington painted a disturbing picture of fanatical resistance that showed no signs of diminishing as American forces approached Japan itself. The kamikaze attacks alone had sunk or damaged over 400 American vessels, demonstrating a level of sacrifice that seemed to intensify rather than weaken as the war progressed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the strategic implications of the Okinawa campaign, found himself questioning the assumptions underlying Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Intelligence estimates suggested that Japanese forces defending Kyushu and Honshu numbered in the millions, supported by a civilian population that had been indoctrinated to resist to the death. If Okinawa cost us 80,000 casualties, Nimitz confided to his staff, what will Japan itself cost us? 500,000, 1 million? The Japanese had indeed demonstrated that they possessed both the capability and will to exact a prohibitive price for any invasion of their homeland. The defense of Okinawa had been conducted with tactical brilliance and strategic foresight that maximized American casualties while preserving Japanese strength for as long as possible. Every lesson learned suggested that Operation Downfall would result in casualties on a scale that would dwarf anything experienced in the European theater. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, had begun his strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities while the Okinawa battle raged. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th had killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night, yet Japanese resistance showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the destruction seemed to strengthen their resolve to fight to the last. Man, woman, and child. Captain William Parsons, a naval ordnance expert working on a classified project in New Mexico, received regular briefings on the Okinawa casualties throughout the spring of 1945. The weapon he was helping to develop might provide an alternative to the meat grinder that Operation Downfall promised to become. The atomic bomb represented a way to end the war without sacrificing hundreds of thousands of American lives in the invasion of Japan. President Harry Truman, who had assumed office following Franklin Roosevelt's death in April, faced the most momentous decision in American history. The casualty projections for Operation Downfall, based largely on the Okinawa experience, suggested that between 500,000 and 1 million American servicemen might die in the invasion of Japan. The alternative was a weapon of unprecedented, destructive power that might shock Japan into surrender. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was successfully tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico. The blinding flash and mushroom cloud represented both the culmination of the Manhattan Project and a potential end to the bloodshed that had characterized the Pacific War. The lessons of Okinawa had convinced American leadership that Japan would never surrender unless faced with destruction beyond their capacity to resist. The Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26th, offered Japan a final opportunity for surrender, while warning of prompt and utter destruction if the offer was rejected. When Japan's government failed to respond, President Truman authorized the use of atomic weapons against Japanese cities. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by the bombing of Nagasaki with Fat Man. The combined death toll from both attacks exceeded 100,000, but Japan surrendered on August 15th, finally bringing the Pacific War to an end. The Battle of Okinawa had served its ultimate purpose from the Japanese perspective, demonstrating that the cost of invading Japan would be prohibitive for American forces. Ironically, this demonstration of Japanese resolve led directly to the decision to use atomic weapons, rather than accept the massive casualties that conventional invasion would have required. The 82,000 American casualties on Okinawa had arguably saved hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides by convincing President Truman that there was no alternative to the atomic bomb. The coral ridges of Okinawa, soaked with the blood of both armies, had become the killing ground that changed the course of history and ushered in the atomic age.